Hey everyone, welcome to Forum Americanum. We are your humble hosts, Cicero and the great Gracchus the Younger, Gracchus Minor.
The
We
lesser.
are the lesser, whatever.
The le- yeah.
You're not lesser in my mind, Gracchus. You're not lesser in my mind.
I don't know. I didn't really reform Rome, so big shoes to fill.
I mean, and that's why, in my opinion, you're not lesser. You didn't reform Rome. It was great. It was a great thing. Anyway, today we're here talking. We're continuing our trend concerning the First Amendment, and last time we talked about freedom of speech and kind of the legal implications surrounding the ideas of freedom of speech. We didn't get really too much into the ethics per se, or even too much into a lot of the Enlightenment founding. We just really want to talk about what is freedom of speech, how does it work in the United States. We definitely didn't get into things like Europe or anything like that, but this week we're following it up with, actually we're kind of taking a step backwards in the amendment, because the First Amendment starts with freedom of religion. A lot of religious people in the United States refer to it as the founding freedom or the mother freedom, because it was obviously important enough for many of the early founding fathers to include straight away, but also a number of colonies either were founded in response to religious persecution or were specifically set up as havens for religious minorities. But we want to talk about what is freedom of religion in the United States, what is kind of its history surrounding it, and what does it mean today, especially as there's a lot of elements in American society now that are trending more secular, but the evangelical segments of the population really haven't changed in terms of population. They've either held steady, maybe slightly growing or slightly declining, depending on which study you look at. So it's an interesting thing because it's more of a clash now than I think we've ever seen before. And I think we both agreed that it was really important, and not only is of course we think the First Amendment's incredibly important, but we were going over our notes and we're like, wow, it's a good thing we definitely didn't try and cram everything into one episode, because you guys definitely don't want to listen to us that long.
Yeah, I agree. Even separating up the First Amendment into multiple episodes, we're still leaving a lot of stuff out. Even after recording last week, I'm like, oh, there is a lot of other stuff you could include just in freedom of speech. You can literally probably make a podcast to this entire subject. Every episode is about freedom of speech. But we don't have the time. We're trying to cover a lot of subjects, so we're going to be moving on to freedom of religion. And like Cicero said, if you know your American history, you know the foundations of a lot of the colonies. Everyone knows or should know in America the story of the Pilgrims. A kind of fringe group in Europe needed religious freedom, so they came to the colonies. And it happened all over the place. You have stuff like the Quakers in Pennsylvania. You ended up having the Catholics in Maryland, the Scotch Irish. Not really religious differences, but you're still coming over here for freedoms they didn't have over there, and you're looking at that kind of everywhere as a kind of a foundational thing, part of how the American colonies or American British colonies were founded on these ideas of freedom of religion and kind of freedom from European oppression at the time. And that is definitely reflected in the ideas of the founding fathers, on top of the Enlightenment ideas, which reflect all these concepts we're talking about here.
So, okay, that's a really interesting point you bring up. You talk about some of the colonies, especially the Puritans in New England. They came over because they were fleeing. Well, they specifically went to Holland first, or the Netherlands, to escape persecution by the Church of England, because they were considered a bit extreme for the Church of England after its break with Rome. But they didn't. While they had the religious freedom they wanted in the Netherlands, they were also very proud of their English identity, and they felt that their children were becoming too Dutch. They came to the New World and founded the Plymouth Bay Colony first, which became the Massachusetts Bay Colony afterwards, if I remember my history correctly. But despite the fact they came here fleeing religious persecution, they did not in any way, shape, or form extend the liberty and freedom to enjoy your religious convictions in their own colonies. They actually expressly forbid groups like the Quakers and Anabaptists and things like that because they found them to be counter to the society they wanted to create. They specifically want to create a Puritan Christian society.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not the best early American historian. If you weren't aware, by our names, we're kind of Latin specialists, so to speak. But yeah, that's a good point. Like, if you have all these different colonies with all their, unique religious identities, how do you bring them all under one umbrella, one, big tent? And I guess the best way is to allow religious freedom under the big tent.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think when I was doing research for this podcast, there were three instances or three things of note before we get to influences of the founding fathers that I thought were important to share. The first one is the Maryland Toleration Act, which is instituted by Lord Baltimore, who was a Catholic peer in the United Kingdom, and specifically created the colony of Maryland. Well, for two reasons. One was for religious to have a religious haven for religious minorities, i.e., Catholics. He really didn't include things like Jews in that. It was really just Catholics, but also allowing Protestants to practice. But he also created it as a means of wealth generation for him and his posterity. But I mean, that's fine. It was land given to him by the crown that was taken from other people, I suppose. But the interesting thing was Lord Baltimore specifically wanted to have a place for all Trinitarian Christians to practice freely, which is generally pretty progressive for the time. If you'll indulge me, Gracchus, I would like to read just a small section.
Yes, and then we are going to need a translation because I'm assuming this is 17th century English, not 21st century English.
It is actually the spelling is worse than the actual language, but
than the grammar.
Yeah, the grammar. Yeah. It's weird. But here's a small section I took from the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649. And whereas the enforcing of the conscience in matters of religion hath frequently fallen out to be of dangerous consequence in those commonwealths where it hath been practiced, and for the more quiet and peaceful government of this province, and the better to preserve mutual love and amity amongst the inhabitants thereof, be it therefore also by the Lord Proprietary, with the advice and consent of this assembly ordained and enacted, except as in this present act is before declared and set forth, that no person or persons whatsoever within this province, or the islands, ports, harbors, creeks, or havens thereunto belonging, professing to believe in Jesus Christ, shall from henceforth be any ways troubled, molested, or discountenanced for or in respect of his or her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof within this province or the islands thereunto belonging, nor any way compelled to the belief or exercise of any other religion against his or her consent, so as they be not unfaithful to the Lord Proprietary, or molest or conspire against the civil government established or to be established in this province under him or his heirs. So I mean, it's strangely enough, the like I said, the spelling, the grammar is much harder to get through because it's annoying. But it's pretty great, straightforward, and you can see the free exercise the free exercise clause in the Constitution. You can clearly see that this does have to have at least some sort of influence on Madison when he is writing the Constitution, and specifically the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, I think we see here, just going to dissect it a little bit, to the belief or exercise of any religion is kind of one of those important parts of the statement there. I mean, if we look back to the First Amendment.
Remember, belief or exercise of religion precedes that by saying professing belief in Jesus Christ.
Yeah. We're not. So if we kind of understand within the context of history at the time, um, you're still dealing with a large wave of trying to convert anyone outside of Christian, large proselytizing movement for all Christianity. It's not like today where like certain aspects of the Christian religion just don't proselytize like they used to. They just don't go out there and go door to door, converting everyone like they once did a few hundred years ago. So I guess if you could take the concept of everyone should believe in this because this is the truth is a little different there. But if you take it from the context of here, like okay, like they assume everyone is believes in Christianity because they're from a Western European background, and everyone they know is from a Western European background. Anyone outside of that is to use the term that was common at the time, kind of like savage outsiders. Again, we are not trying to express these ideas. We're just reflecting the ideas of the time, which is you have to kind of take things in context a little bit.
John said, "Don't shoot me. I'm just the piano player."
yeah, pretty much. But I think the other interesting aspect, we're going to jump around a little bit, but later on, in 1790, President George Washington writes a letter to the Jewish population of Newport, and this letter kind of expresses some really fun and interesting ideas of how that as long as you're a good citizen, like the U.S. government doesn't care. I guess his words are, the government of the United States would gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. And that is kind of his response to even non-Christians that live within the United States government. This is, after this is first president responding to people regarding Christian religion.
That's why Washington continues to get my vote as best president we've ever had.
Yeah, first best. Actually, no, Thomas Jefferson, but we'll get to him later.
He's a good one. He's no Washington though. Washington's just, I don't know. Like, yeah, we'll get to it. We don't want to get the weeds.
Yes, I feel sorry for jumping ahead there, but I feel like when we're talking about the relationship between the freedom of religion for all Christians compared to the freedom of religion for everyone in the early American, like early colonial, post-colonial period of American history, like it's kind of important to throw that in there. That shortly after the establishment of the U.S. government, they're like, no, everyone's free.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to put up because in New York City specifically, they had actually originally set up in the original Flushing Town Charter. They had said that there was going to be a freedom of religion, and I think his name is Peter Stuyvesant. I don't know how the Dutch pronounce it. I just know in New York they say Stuyvesant. I think his first name is Peter, but he was the governor. He had outlawed Quakers from coming in. Quakers, like the nicest people ever. They make Mormons look angry. But a number of citizens had petitioned him. It's what's called the Flushing Remonstrance of 1657. And they said, "We desire, therefore, in this case, not to judge, lest we be judged, neither to condemn, lest we be condemned, but rather let every man stand or fall to his own master. We are bound by the law to do good unto all men, especially to those of the household of faith. And though for the present we seem to be unsensible for the law and the lawgiver, yet when death and the law assault us, if we have our advocate to seek, who shall plead for us in this case of conscience betwixt God and our own souls? The powers of this world can neither attach us nor excuse us, for if God justify, who can condemn? And if God condemn, there is none can justify." And they were arguing for, they were petitioning Stuyvesant to allow Quakers to exist. It's an interesting thing that you see folks who are concerned enough about the rights of minorities. And this is a Dutch colony, so they probably, I would say, there's a fair chance that a lot of the religious freedom that was expressed in the Netherlands had translated into their colonies here. But I think the most interesting situation is there were 4 colonies that were founded with specific guarantees for religious freedom. They were Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And Rhode Island was founded by the Baptist Roger Williams, who actually was physically chased from the city of Salem in Massachusetts because he was considered, essentially a heretic. And Connecticut and New Jersey, I believe, were both founded by Thomas Hooker, who was a Congregationalist, like the Puritans of New England, or of Massachusetts. He just took a more conciliatory tone. But most famously is Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, who himself was a Quaker. And the interesting thing about Pennsylvania, up until the Revolution, when the Declaration of Independence was signed and Pennsylvania turned over its sovereignty in a lot of ways to the new Continental Congress, they had essentially nearly unlimited freedom for religious practice in the colony of Pennsylvania, which I find really interesting because in a lot of ways the colony of Pennsylvania had greater religious freedom than even we now enjoy.
Yeah, that's all very. It's really interesting how you see the development of like individual religious freedom laws of all the colonies. They kind of develop like, obviously ideas are shared between the colonies, but they're all kind of similar in a way, except for Massachusetts. But they're very they're similar. Yeah, those Puritans. They're similar in a lot of ways. Of you come here, different ideas, yet the same, different religious beliefs, yet under the same general concept of Christianity, but still understand the importance of the freedom of religion and how it needs to be separated from government, because you're coming from like state-run religions in Europe. You're coming from the Church of England, the Catholic Church in like France and Italy and stuff like that, where you're like, actually Italy wasn't a country, but you get my drift. Where the rights of the sovereign and the rights of God are indistinguishable from one another. Like if you look at Thomas Hobbes, who is the counter to Locke and counter the other political philosophers that inspired the founding fathers, it's like the only person a king could reports to is himself and God. And so when you have this real mix of religion and state control, it's very understandable to see how people that kind of not necessarily flee, but have a desire to escape that sort of tyranny, that they're going to find that any sort of connection between the state and religion to be a little distasteful because of their experience.
Yeah, what's interesting is, especially with Hobbes, he's the first one to, in a very clear and concise way, he kind of takes my own writings and the writings of Aquinas, and he amalgamates them into clearly formulating the idea of natural, or as some people say, God-given or endowed by the Creator, in the words of Thomas Jefferson. Regardless of, let's just say, natural rights, he says he recognizes the idea of natural rights, but he, instead of like Locke accepting them and saying that the government is specifically meant to protect them and the Constitution is there to ensure that they are protected, he goes the other direction and says, well, we can't use natural rights because that's terrifying. We got to have a sovereign who decides the will of the people. But I guess we're going to get way off into the weeds if we're not careful here. But yeah, it's really interesting that these guys, a lot of these, especially in the northern half of the colonies, they're mostly religiously based colonies. But interestingly enough, most of the southern colonies, Georgia was a penal colony. It's the original Australia, as I like to say. And most of them were crown colonies in the South, Virginia especially. But Virginia is especially interesting because that's where we see during the Revolution, long before the Constitution is written, Thomas Jefferson introduced into, I think it was still called the House of Burgesses at the time, which is essentially the current state assembly. He introduced the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and I think the opening line is just stunningly brilliant. It says, "Well aware that the opinions and belief of man depend not on their own will, but follow involuntarily evidence proposed to their minds, that whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, and manifested his supreme will, that free shall remain by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burthens, or by civil incapacitations, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do so, but to extend it by its influence on reason alone." Interestingly enough, considering Jefferson was almost assuredly a deist, he takes an overtly religious tone in this, but uses the authority of God through creation and the manifestation of mankind. He uses the authority of God to justify why the independence and liberty of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion is so important. And I mean, it's kind of a brilliant coup by Jefferson, because who can he makes a sound, rational argument. Well, God created us, and we're in the image of God, so therefore we must have some inherent worth. And this kind of plays into Locke and other Enlightenment authors who are writing about this, especially Aquinas. Well, he's not Enlightenment, but he is a foundation for them. But he really builds upon this, and it's a pretty unassailable position from, especially an 18th century understanding of the world.
Oh yeah. It's kind of interesting to see modern people try to pick apart 18th century Enlightenment philosophers and individuals like our founding fathers, and try to put them forward in history post Darwin discoveries, post a lot of scientific advancements that have been able to, kind of separate us from a basic understanding of there is no other rational idea besides that creation and existence stems from God. And when if they come before that, anything besides that is an option, right? So there's a few crazy Enlightenment people that are no, they kind of reject any of that. But you get Jefferson, and you get Hume. Hume is exactly who I'm referring to. You have Jefferson, you have Paine, you have a few others who some modern people try to ascribe an atheist belief. And you're like, well, if you're an atheist at the time, you're being irrational. And you look at these people are supremely rational. They're attempting to be rational. I'm not saying Paine is completely rational with his distaste for religion. No, he's not. He has an axe to grind. He's being irrational. But if you view Jefferson's belief, Jefferson has a belief. I mean, you can't disagree with that, because you can't put him forward in history and be like, hey, what do you think now? Because he wasn't alive to make those assertions and statements.
He's clearly a classic deist.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm trying to say anyone out there who says Jefferson's an atheist is wrong. I'm going to make a bold and clear statement.
I think Jefferson didn't care enough about what people thought that if he really was an atheist, he would have out and said it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't illegal. I mean, Hume was pretty casual. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like he is saying an atheist. Sometimes it's saying he's a deist. It's hard to say. But Voltaire was clearly an atheist and very vocal about it. And Jean-Paul Marat, who is another French revolutionary author who's pretty contemporary to the Founding Fathers, he was also a strict atheist. But Voltaire was very successful, very popular, very essential to a lot of the Founding Fathers' philosophy. But the guy was very open about his atheism. And I would imagine in France, where the Catholic Church held much, much stronger sway than any church other than maybe Massachusetts ever held in the United States, he was clearly open about it. And I mean, I don't think Jefferson would have hit it if he really was. I don't find the evidence to say that he would have.
Yeah, there's really no evidence. But also, like Voltaire also worked with a pseudonym, so there is there's a certain amount of discretion he's still using. And if you talk about Hume, like Hume still doesn't like release some of his works regarding religion till like posthumously. He's not confronting the church with his or confronting the Church of England.
The Presbyterian Church in Scotland.
Was Scotland separated from England at the time? I can't remember.
Well, they weren't, but Scotland has always had its own established church, the Church of Scotland, which is Presbyterian, in contrast to the Church of England, which is Anglican.
All right. Well, sorry, I'm not a Scottish historian, but either way,
church history.
Yeah, either way, you're still seeing, if you like Voltaire and Hume and more out and out people are still kind of careful about how they treat their interaction with the state, because they're under European autocratic systems that still have like church and state are intermingled, and that it will influence their ability to come out in the open. But
Paine didn't publish The Rights of Man till he was dead. But I think when I read The Rights of Man, part of the reason Paine, he talks about how he specifically asked for it to wait for it to be published. But I mean, I think part of that is that Paine, there's some of the founding fathers were brilliant intellectuals and ardent Christians, and they would have happily debated this in public, but they were never given the chance because Paine refused to publish things until he was dead, which I kind of find annoying and rather cowardly, frankly. I know it's kind of rude to say, but I'll say it. Cicero had his head chopped off and his tongue stabbed by Mark Antony's wife for saying what he thought.
Hey, anyway, the crack guy.
We're digressing. So yeah, I was really interested when I was read through the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, because it's clearly done before the Constitution is introduced into the Virginia Assembly by Jefferson. And interestingly enough, he does this while he's serving in the Continental Congress. So I kind of wondered, why didn't Jefferson want to introduce this to the Continental Congress? And the best thing I can come up with is because Jefferson was a huge fan of the Articles of Confederation and was a reluctant supporter of the Constitution. So I think the reason he didn't ever try and do something like this with the Continental Congress is because he never really felt that the federal government should have that kind of authority.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, if we're not really, I guess when you ever talk about the early American freedoms of religion, Jefferson is like a central figure, right? Like you can't really talk about, especially how his words directly reflect how we view the freedom of religion, and how the first, like, I have zero evidence on this, zero whatsoever, but most people might mistake Jefferson's words regarding the freedom of religion with that of the actual First Amendment, because it's so such a large part of our understanding of it. I'm clearly referring to the separation of church and state. That's not a part of the First Amendment. It's literally like it's a letter to a church that he wrote as president.
Well, you actually bring me to my next point.
Yeah.
Which is the letter. It's a letter. You're right. It's a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists. And in it he says, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." He's obviously referring to the Constitution there, and the Bill of Rights specifically, "thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties." So he writes this while he's president, because Baptists were actually a widely persecuted denomination in the early colonies, and they were the Danbury Baptists specifically were concerned that some of the religious tests and stuff might come back, because even though it was unconstitutional, which I guess we should just probably read that section. So on Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, it says the senators and representatives before mentioned and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers both of the United States and of the several states shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. I mean, I think that's interesting because, well, we talk about, for example, you know, like you said, the separation of church and state. You're absolutely right. So many people. I mean, I remember growing up, people's separation of church and state, separation of church and state, and it's actually really bad that people say that because when I was younger, I personally was much more zealous religiously and much more aggressive in my faith, and it felt like a watershed moment of that it definitely lent into the whole conspiracy idea that a lot of Christians have concerning the education system and things like that, because you're ground in with the idea of separation of church and state, but when you actually look into the Constitution, it never says that. And I found it on my own reading that letter, and it felt like I was justified in a lot of my arguments against secularists, because it just felt, I don't know. You tell me what you think, but I just felt like it was kind of disingenuous, and it was just inaccurate. And I don't know. What are your thoughts, Gragus?
I feel like, yes, it's inaccurate. I'm like, that's kind of referencing for earlier, that this idea of separation of church and state is an accurate representation of what is expressed in the Bill of Rights. It's not, but it does, in words really only Jefferson can describe, give the sentiment and the intention behind the words. Like, you know, this is building a wall of eternal separation. Like, that is, you know, if you look at the Bill of Rights, it's saying, like, you know, expressing these natural rights, you know, unequivocally as a separation of church and state. And I can see your perspective on the matters where, you know, it's, you know, you hear this argument and then the argument has no legal framework. Like, if people are trying to use that argument from some sort of legal perspective, they're wrong. And just because someone is wrong in their expression of the legal framework doesn't mean the concept behind it is incorrect. It's just terribly expressed. It's just, I agree, like, this should not be the way you represent the argument to the general public. You need to be like, no, like, the Congress can make no laws regarding the establishment of a religion. You can do whatever you want, but, well, whatever you want within reason, because there are limitations. The normal one, you can't create something that, you know, takes freedoms away from others, that kind of idea. But the Congress, you know, our legal system can't go, you have to be this, you have to be that, you have to be that. And including within the actual words of the Constitution, you know, Article 6 is like, you also don't have to have a religious belief to hold office or do anything. Although there has been kind of, you know, because of our society at large has been Christian, you know, predominantly, even now it's still predominantly Christian. And if people believe that you need a certain moral foundation to be a good elected official, it's a test not imposed by the government, but a test imposed by the people. I know I'm kind of separating away from the point you originally made, but I fundamentally agree that there is a separation of church and state, but not necessarily a separation between the population and what they put into representative government. But, you know, obviously representative government is a reflection of the people, so they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, and, you know, what's funny is, you know, I was thinking maybe we could touch on this in the end, but you kind of segued perfectly into this whole religious test. that is clearly expressly prohibited in the Constitution. It's popped up over and over in American history. I mean, I think there's 7 or 8 states that still have in their constitutions, it's just unenforceable, as per rulings by the Supreme Court after the 14th Amendment incorporated everything to the states. There's 7 or 8 states that still have in their state constitutions religious tests required to hold public office in those states.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's funny because this has been largely used to protect Catholics, because Catholics have traditionally been, even though they're the largest single Christian denomination in the United States, and they have been for some time, they are still officially more of a religious minority because the United States is overwhelmingly Protestant. But this kind of leads into this happened even this year. And we will, as always, we link everything in our notes that are tied to the show, so please feel free to check. But there was a lot of hubbub with one of President Trump's nominees to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. Her name was Amy. Her name is. She's not dead. Her name's Amy Coney Barrett, and she's a Notre Dame law professor. And there was a lot of interesting questions during her confirmation, which she did eventually pass, but specifically Dianne Feinstein was pretty loud about this. She said that she was educating a law professor from Notre Dame, which I don't think people find as some insane zealous school. It's pretty well respected, even though people openly admit that Notre Dame probably tends towards the conservative and tends towards what is, of course, very Catholic. It is the Catholic university. But I don't think anyone, even an atheist such as yourself, Grax, would find. I don't think anyone would find it a school in disrepute.
Oh, absolutely not. No.
and certainly to be a law professor there is certainly a high honor. But Senator Feinstein said she was trying to tell, I assume it's Justice Barrett. Now I don't know how we refer to appeals court justices, but. She said that dogma and law are two different things, and she was concerned that the dogma lives loudly within her. I'm paraphrasing. And a number of Catholics were very concerned because they didn't see this being handed out to other religious individuals, and they were very concerned that, I mean, this is what happened to JFK, right? There was a lot of talk that, you can't have a pope or a Catholic, and this happens every single, after it ended with JFK, thank God, but up until JFK, every time a Catholic ran for president, it was always concerned that the Pope would now control the U.S. And there's a lot of anti-Catholic bias in the U.S. traditionally. I mean, I get it. There's a historical precedent for the fact that Rome traditionally subjected and persecuted Protestants. And since Rome has Roman Catholic countries make up most of the population of Europe, there's a lot of concern, and it's kind of just something that's just been passed down generation to generation that the Roman Catholic Church was out to get Protestantism still. But I think Vatican II and JFK changed that. But I mean, this is something that's even to this day we still see. We still have to see. A judicious application of that part of the Constitution which forbids religious tests. I don't know. What do you think? Am I wrong? Am I misinterpreting? What are your thoughts, Gracchus?
I think that the obviously religious tests are unconstitutional, and it's still whether it is in law or not, there's still going to be this underlying question of where the ultimate loyalty lies. I think is where a lot of this came from. It's because, as you were speaking about JFK and the Pope, the big question at the time was, where does JFK's loyalty lie? The U.S. or Rome? Like, where is this going to be? And so when you're dealing with, I don't know where Dianne Feinstein's train of thought was going to, probably just pick up on the loose string, but there's still kind of this, there's because we're, not officially Protestant, but mostly Protestant, you're going to have this kind of still conflict, 520 years after the fact, from like the split from Protestant from the Catholic Church, and it's still a wound that's still there, whether people want to admit it or not, and that still shows up in our politics. But regarding like religious tests, we do have some Supreme Court cases kind of looked at here, and one of the more interesting ones regarding a religious test was what we had here was Turcaso versus Watkins, 1960. It was another Warren Court decision. But this is early Warren Courts. You had some of the other major features of that. But effectively was asking, does a state require that a candidate for public office profess a belief in God? And what the unanimous decision of the Warren Court was that you can't force an official to, have a religious test, profess belief in anything, hold office. And this, it's clear cut case, and you have the entirety, a unanimous decisions of the Supreme Court are pretty resounding regarding. Yeah, they are very rare, especially this part of the Warren Court. If I don't know, we're not a Supreme Court thing, but the early Warren Court had a few people that just didn't get along with each other. But effectively, the point of this is the opinion, the majority opinion was actually written by Justice Black on this case, which tells you of, I guess, how important, how unanimous this idea of like you can't have obviously a clear cut is kind of a clear cut idea that you can't have a religious test for the individual. But it's pretty surprising to me that there are still states that have religious tests out there, formal religious tests to hold a office.
Yeah, but they are unenforceable. I think it's just a matter of it's being a text in their state constitution. They know they can't enforce it, so why even bother amending it? But yeah, that's really interesting. When I was looking through stuff for this, I didn't realize that the U.S. Supreme Court generally avoided rulings on religious subjects up until it didn't start really till the 1930s. Well after the 14th Amendment was put into place, but especially before the 14th Amendment, it really didn't talk about it at all. The one time that it seemed like a significant case popped up was in Reynolds v. U.S., which is 1878, and it was really talking about the ability of Congress to what extent can Congress or the United States demand a religious freedom be halted, because this is concerning the state of Utah and whether or not they would accept Utah into the United States as a new state, considering ironically it wasn't the well, I guess you could call it a stranglehold that the Mormon Church held on politics in the state. It was actually about the idea of polygamy, and in the decision, there was a great line that came out of it. This is one I just loved researching for this podcast because the way people wrote back then was just so much more delightful. But it says, laws are made for the government of actions, and while they cannot interfere with mere religious belief and opinions, they may with practices. Suppose one believed that human sacrifices were a necessary part of religious worship. Would it be seriously contended that the civil government under which he lived could not interfere or to prevent a sacrifice? Or if a wife religiously believed it was her duty to burn herself upon the funeral pile of her dead husband, would it be beyond the power of the civil government to prevent her from carrying her belief into practice? So I think they do a really good job of saying, okay, there has to be a reasonable extent to religious freedom. Because it's not just a matter of polygamy. In fact, he doesn't even use it as an idea. It does technically use a slippery slope argument, which isn't the strongest, but he does use an argument from absurdium to talk about how, if you don't put any type, if the government, the civil government, can't put any restriction on practice at all, then you get some wacky things that can start to be practiced. So I thought that was really interesting that because and that does specifically deal with a federal case, right? That is distinctly a new territory applying for statehood, and Congress making a requirement that it change its own laws before it's considered acceptable. But then we start diving into the 30s and the 40s, and I mean, it's just like Warren Court just seems to strike one blow for liberty after another.
Yeah.
They're just killing it. But I don't know. There was some things that I saw which were really cool, and what, like, we can go over some of these like smaller ones a little bit later. But I think one that was probably really important for us to talk about is Engel v. Vitale. It's the one about prayer in schools, and I don't know. You talked about it to me before the show, before we started recording. So I just want to see, like, I want you to reiterate your thoughts for everyone.
Oh yeah. So I guess the idea of like prayer in school. So this was I guess a brief summary as best I can. Pretty much, the state of New York kind of forced prayer at the start of school, and it was just a general non-denominational Christian prayer. Court said no, pretty much saying because it does violate the Establishment of Religion clause, and that's what it was. Is because neither like the non-denominational aspect of it or anything aspect with the problem, but is because the state was officially selecting something to be done in school that's related to religion, because it's a state not enforcing but forcing upon the school a specific religion, is choosing for the school the religion. And that was the issue with that one. And then you kind of see there's a whole bunch of cases regarding prayer in school, and this is kind of the major one that kicks it off. Is this Engel versus Vitale is really the kicker. And again, you can guess what court it is, and you could probably guess who did the majority opinion. And yeah, anytime it comes with the idea of you can't play preferences when regarding religion, and this is kind of the one, like, you can't say, okay, we're going to push one religion over the other. And it's, if you kind of look back at a lot of the stuff we're talking about earlier regarding the founding fathers and early American ideas of religion, is just practice on your own, and the state can't say anything otherwise. It's just which is kind of conflicting with the Mormon ruling we were just talking about, is the idea of practice what you want within the rule of law. You can't go to an extent, because there's exceptions to all this, because I'm sure some of you are familiar or may not be familiar with other later court cases regarding drug use, illegal drug use within some religions, and there's protections for that, but it's also the like do no harm to others kind of idea of I suppose natural rights, where it goes, as long as your right does not take away rights from others or the ability to live of others, like then it's kind of a free for all. And this kind of reflects that, especially the freedom of religion across the board reflects practice what you want, but do no harm to others. And if the state, such as this case, says you must practice, or picks one thing over the other, you're stepping too much into the decision of what to believe from the perspective of the state.
Yeah, and then you start to cross into a scary realm, right? With the state. I mean, that's one of the cases you sent to me, which was Cantwell v. Connecticut, and it was, the ruling of the court was basically, the state was taking a far too active role in determining religious truth.
Yeah, and that's a very good one to bring up, because that's like the first time the Supreme Court interfered with the state, used the 14th Amendment to interfere with the state regarding their religious laws. Up until that point, it was kind of a free-for-all for states. They could make their own religious laws. Clearly, there's a lot of them, as we're referencing. But the Supreme Court and the federal government kind of, took no action regarding it up until that point. And then it was like, actually, hold on. This is 1940, so this is long after the 14th Amendment. So it took them a very long time to start applying the connection between the 14th Amendment. Yeah, which is really interesting, which is kind of, as I was talking about earlier, like what is the opinion of the population regarding this? Clearly, the majority, this is one of those tyranny of the majority situations. The majority had no serious qualms with the application of religion from a state level, not federal level. I was referring to state earlier as reflection of government, like a state as in a country, to have some clarification. But clearly earlier, no one had really any issues because it was reflecting the predominant religion of the time. And so it wasn't until later on that you started to get a little bit more mixed, and they're like, oh, hold on, like what happens when I'm the minority? Is this just? Is this moral? Is this ethical? The real fundamental questions are being asked and answered.
Well, it's funny because I found a little thing. Cantwell was what was his name? Newton Cantwell was a Jehovah's Witness, and this is what he brought. Like the state of Connecticut was trying to enforce a religious, trying to inform religious dogma, and Justice Harlan Stone said that the Jehovah's Witnesses ought to have an endowment in view of the aid which they give in solving the legal problems of civil liberties. Like it or not, another American author was Irving Dillard. It's like it or not, Jehovah's Witnesses have done more to preserve our freedoms than any other religious group. And when I was looking through this, it was crazy. Between 1938 and 1946, Jehovah's Witnesses brought 23 cases before the Supreme Court regarding the First Amendment. 23 in freaking 8 years. That is crazy. And it's because they were religiously persecuted. And so, I think the overall thing was like in their entire time they brought 72 cases, and they've won something like 25 or 26 of them. I can't remember exactly. But this kind of they really got the ball rolling on getting the court to incorporate the First Amendment to the states. And they might have some interesting beliefs, but I got to give credit, man. They've really done a number for ensuring minority protection from tyranny of the majority, as you said.
Yeah, so I guess next time they knock on your door, thank them, and then ask them politely to leave. Yeah.
Offer them a shot of whiskey, and when they decline, you say, well, I tried. But yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting thing that these are mostly like Catholic and Protestant authorities that were saying, these wackadoos, we can't have them talking about stuff. And it's funny because when we were in our last podcast talking about freedom of speech, it was also Jehovah's Witnesses that got a lot of those cases regarding free speech. It's really interesting that they figured out how to utilize the courts to guarantee the fair application of freedom. And I got to give them credit. It's great. It's really awesome. So they had that. The other one that I thought was kind of important for us to talk about, there's a few small ones we can go over really quickly, but the Lemon v. Kurtzman case in 1971, instituting what they call the Lemon Test. And I don't know. I have very mixed feelings on this one. Why don't you give us the overview, Rackus, and then we'll discuss.
All right. Yeah. The Lemon Test. It's set like a 3-pronged test for the constitutionality of a statute, right? Like, so you're dealing with a statute regarding anything really. It's either reimbursing a religious school or doing whatever. It's gonna is it legal? Is the statute, or is it constitutional? It would have to pass this 3-prong, which is, first, it has a mainly secular purpose. The second part is its principal effect neither adds nor inhibits religion. And third, government and religion are not excessively entangled. And like we last episode, we talked about the Brandenburg test. It doesn't hold as much weight as the Brandenburg test, but it still establishes kind of a test you can reference to the constitutionality of a statute.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I don't in principle have a problem with the lemon test. It's just to me, it's awfully vague. The Brandenburg test is pretty clear, right? This is more like the or how what someone says. Its principal effect neither aids nor inhibits religion. Well, how are we defining aid and inhibiting, right? How are we, or the third statute, which or the third prong, which they call it the entanglement prong. It cannot result in excessive government entanglement with religion. Well, what does that mean? I mean, this came up in this case last year, I think, maybe earlier this year, about a religious school, and it's a Lutheran. I think it was a preschool in Missouri. They applied for a state grant to say, okay, we want to replace the playground equipment with safer playground equipment, and they were denied. Ironically, under a law that was meant to prevent Catholics from getting access to public funds and things like that, they were denied because under that law, and a lot of people thought the courts would uphold that, but applying the lemon test, they said, oh well, it's a religious school, the government can't provide funds. But they said no, it doesn't matter what the religious. It's not as though this playground is being used to train ministers. It's simply a playground, and they thought it was obscene that that a playground. At least some of the justices thought it was crazy. It's just a playground. It's not. There's nothing. It's not as though the state is giving money for the express ordination of ministers, which would clearly violate the Establishment Clause, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I don't know. I've heard some people say we need to do away with the lemon test. There needs to be a better one. I don't know. I mean, the question I have is, okay, so you say we need to do away with it, and the courts need to put in something better. Well, I've never seen someone recommend something better.
The lemon test kind of reminds me of the earlier test on freedom of speech. That's what it kind of reminds me of. It's not clear and cut. It's not a high bar you have to jump over like the Brandenburg test. It's just kind of an ambiguous, vague. Just as long as it doesn't entangle and it doesn't like directly, support or inhibit or something like that. There needs to be a newer ruling that kind of makes things a little bit more clear cut. But I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, because that's not really. It's kind of a tough subject to tackle. Is what clearly supports or does not support religion from a governmental perspective, and yeah, that's the tough part.
I mean, I think a high bar is probably a good idea. At least in my opinion, it helps to prevent a lot of what I would consider more frivolous lawsuits. Like, I've got a couple examples that in my research, and I've seen people argue over this quite a bit, and it's really frustrating because these seem to be rather innocuous, and they aren't always, but in a lot of ways, some of these are. So, like Van Orden v. Perry. This happened when I was in college. It was a gentleman sued the state of Texas because there was a monument to the Ten Commandments on the state capitol grounds. Now, interestingly enough, on the same day, the Supreme Court released two different decisions regarding Ten Commandment monuments, and largely it was the same justices on each side, except for Justice Stephen Breyer, who voted to remove the McCreary County courthouse in Kentucky. He said that they should be removing those Ten Commandments, but then voted that the state of Texas was okay. So he voted on both sides of the issue on the same freaking day. It's almost impossible to see, like, how in the heck can you do that? Because it seems really inconsistent. But he does a really good job, I think. He concurs with a judgment in favor of Texas, but not necessarily the wider opinion. But in his own words, he said the case before us is a borderline case. It concerns a large granite monument bearing the text of the Ten Commandments located on the grounds of the Texas state capitol. On the one hand, The commandments' text undeniably has a religious message, invoking, indeed emphasizing, the deity. On the other hand, focusing on the text of the commandments alone cannot conclusively resolve this case. Rather, to determine the message that the text here conveys, we must examine how the text is used, and that inquiry requires us to consider the context of the display. And he has his justifications, which is really frustrating because I think he had a great chance to set a new type of test with his opinion, but he didn't. He everything was tailored specifically to this case. And he said, for his justifications were like the monument had been there for 40 years on the Texas state grounds, indicating that non-religious aspects of the tablet's message predominated, are predominant in it. And he also noted that the group that donated the monument, the Fraternal Order of Eagles, is a private civic group, and it's primarily secular. And while they're interested in the religious aspect of the Ten Commandments, they sought to highlight the commandments' roles in shaping civic morality as part of that organization's efforts to combat juvenile delinquency. His next point was that the Eagles consulted with a committee composed of members of several faiths in order to find a non-sectarian text, an act which underscores the group's ethics-based motives and not religious-based motives. Then he says the tablets as displayed on the monument prominently acknowledge that the Eagles donated the display, which I do think is actually kind of important. And then the last one, the physical setting of the monument suggests little or nothing of the sacred. So it sits in a large park containing 17 monuments and 21 historical markers, all designed to illustrate the ideals of those who settled in Texas and of those who lived there since that time. The setting does not readily lend itself to meditation or any other religious activity. I've been to it. It really doesn't. The setting does not provide a context of history and moral ideas or ideals. And the large display, together with the display's inscription about its origin, communicates to visitors that the state sought to reflect moral principles, illustrating a relation between ethics and law that the state's citizens, historically speaking, have endorsed. That is to say, the context suggests that the state intended the display's moral message, an illustrative message reflecting the historical ideals of Texans, to predominate. So, I mean, he does give, I think fairly rational and really good justifications, but like I said, I'm disappointed in the fact that he could have taken the lemon test and done away with it and made a better test, but instead he elected for more of a narrow justification.
And that's what's really been any sort of wide test is very ambiguous, and it seems to me that any sort of ruling regarding religious freedoms is very narrow. It's very specific to whatever the specific religious situation they're encountering. It just covers that, doesn't cover anything else, and which is frustrating from our perspective because we're trying to find a good test to judge the freedom of religion and religious freedoms within the country, and there's really none. The best you can do is you can go back to assertions and statements from our founders, and that's about it. And everything else is just kind of ambiguous. And I guess that's the thing is belief extent is ambiguous. It's kind of personal and extremely individualistic. And that, yeah, it has to be, and that's reflected by a lot of the words, written by founding fathers in their relationship with the deities. It's personal, and it's not the job of a government to dictate how that personal relationship extends, and that's kind of a reflection of the individualistic principles that are foundational to this country, and it's kind of important to use that as your kind of guide for viewing this relationship as it's personal, and there's no place in government for it.
Yeah, I guess that's I don't know. It's just it does get really tiresome to me and very saddening to see Americans go just so hot and heavy against each other. Our own citizens, our own countrymen, just lambasting the other side because of their insistence on one side of religion or another, and especially because the ambiguity of the law. You see a lot of frivolous things. I mean, this one of the things I wanted to bring up here is, I mean, I don't know if you have been to Arlington, in D.C. But the headstones all have religious markers on them, even pagan markers and Islamic markers. But in Maryland, that's what they call the Peace Cross. It's the Peace Cross of, I think it's Prince George County, I think it's also called the Bladensburg Peace Cross. But yeah, it's in Prince George's County, and it was erected in, I think, 1919. It was paid for through donations from the American Legion and private citizens. It was the groundbreaking was held in 1919. And it's a giant cross, it's 40 feet tall or some crap like that. It's huge. It's really big, but it's a war memorial. It's there to memorialize the citizens from Prince George County who died in World War I. And I think it's the American Humanist Society, or maybe it was the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I feel like a jerk because I can't remember off the top of my head. It's the American Humanist Association. That's what it is. They filed a lawsuit saying that the cross, this memorial, violated the Establishment Clause of the United States. And I mean, honestly, you're an atheist, Gracchus. Do you really think that this thing violates the Establishment Clause? I think it's crazy to think so. I mean,
it doesn't. It clearly doesn't. And I am. There's no reason to say it does, especially when you're it's a memorial. It's reflective of service. You can't really go out of your way and say, well, it was created to establish a religion, and while you can, because it's on public lands, all sorts of stuff like that, you can kind of create murky, ambiguous arguments, again, in an ambiguous context of the law, which should never be ambiguous. But if you're going to address this reasonably, be a rational humanist about this, it's a war memorial. Treat it as thus and move on to fight bigger fights when you see actions that address where you actually try to create religious-based social norms on people through the government. You want to stop stuff like that. You don't want to stop a 100-year-old war memorial. That's a waste of time and effort and doesn't really create any benefit. And it doesn't. It definitely. I'm going to say, reiterate myself that it has nothing to do with the establishment of religion. It's a war memorial paid by private citizens. Just drop it and move on.
Yeah, I personally I would join anyone to say if Congress. I've been pretty vocal about how one of the things that disgusts me as a member of the GOP is that I hate theocracy. And there's a lot of in the moral situations where the GOP the Bible does this. Well, I'm sorry, the Bible may be an authority to myself and to other Christians, but to non-Christians it is not an authority at all, and it's not a justification for civil law. I'm sorry. And that, to me, if you use the Bible or a religious text of any kind as a justification, then it clearly violates the Establishment Clause. But this is just citizens. And honestly, I think this does atheists a greater disservice by making, atheists are amongst the most distrusted demographic in the country. Slightly more distrusted than homosexuals and Muslims. And at least that was a Pew poll I saw. But anyway, the point I'm making is things like this make people distrustful of atheists. Say, oh, well, I'm not here to take away your religion. I'm not here to do anything like that. But this is just it's a war memorial that was put up over 100 years ago, or well, almost 100 years ago now, and they're suing the county, trying to get it to take down. And it's crazy is the fourth Court of Appeals said that it is a violation of the Establishment Clause, which I think is nuts, especially considering in 2009 in Salazar v. Buono, there was a cross, a Latin cross, put up in the Mojave Desert by of the VFW to honor war dead, and in their decision, in one of the decisions from a concurring decision from Justice Alito, he said that it's not necessarily cross. Yes, while it is a recognizable and fundamental part of Christian culture, it is not necessarily and always a religious symbol. It can very much be a civil symbol as well. And I think he's largely right on that. But I'll be interested to see how this actually plays out, because this flies in the face of, I believe, flies in the face, in my opinion, of a Supreme Court, a precedent from the Supreme Court. But yeah, I think I mean, just like it's dangerous and damaging for Christians to put punitive laws in place against minorities such as members of the LGBT community. I think just as well, it doesn't do atheists a service to file these frivolous lawsuits against monuments that have been there for a century now and really aren't. I mean, it's not really doing anything. It's just a cross that has the name of the 49 war dead from that county in World War I.
Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. Yeah, there's I kind of tend to follow the thing of kind of pick your battles, and that's not one you should be picking. There's more important things to be dealing with regarding, establishment clauses and the relationship of religion and the state. That's not something important, and really you're not going to go anywhere with it.
No, and especially considering Americans really don't warm to the idea of like military death memorials. Like, they're Americans. I mean, it's just not something people are very fond of people coming down on that, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah, I don't know. I guess I got a little on a soapbox there. I've just seen people, like, in all honesty, say that yeah, this is clearly a violation of the Establishment Clause, and it just boggles my mind. I think it just plays into the whole tribalism thing that we've talked about a couple times now. Is that you're more interested in supporting your side, whether it's right or wrong, because it's your side.
Yeah, and religion, because of its ideological nature, just plays so well into picking a side, because it is a very absolute ideology you're assigning yourself to. And so when you get in these discussions, especially religious, it's hard not to be tribal in certain ways, but it's very important to recognize the difference between your religion and your government, because they're not the same thing, and nor should they be the same thing. They're different. We've created a set of laws and beliefs as a country that have over time both separated them more and more and enforced the ability of each individual to pursue their own personal truth.
Yeah,
no, that's important.
I agree, and it's while I was prepping for this, I was really happy to see that in a lot of European countries, the government has tamped down on individual liberty quite a bit more than I'm comfortable with. But in the United States, especially because of Warren and we've had, I think, 4 great Chief Justices in a row: Earl Warren, Warren Burger, William Rehnquist, and John Roberts have all done, I think, a fairly good job of trying to play a mediating factor on the court between the two sides. I mean, Warren was a Republican but a liberal. Burger was a conservative, but more of a libertarian-minded. Rehnquist was a traditionalist, but he didn't try and dominate the court, at least that I could tell. And Roberts has, I think, played a fairly strong moderate in managing a lot of his cases. And I think we have to be thankful for the fact that the courts have done a good job of tending to the side of liberty more than they have to the side of restriction, especially when it comes to religion and speech. And they've done a stellar job, I think.
Yeah, for the most part, I'm not going to say they're infallible, because absolutely not. There's, we all have decisions we disagree with, clearly. But yeah, they've done a overall good job in the past, 40, 50 years in deciding most decisions. I obviously going to have a few I disagree with.
Oh,
but
of course. I mean, and we're going to have to do, I think when we do our interview with our guest about freedom of religion. We're going to have a talk about, like, what about the Hobby Lobby ruling? What about prayer in Congress? The courts ruled that in a 5-4 that it's, if governments, if citizens want to open with a blessing, then it's okay. I don't know. I'm kind of mixed on that. The federal government I'm less okay with local communities I'm more okay with, because local citizens should have more control over their government and how it's managed. But I don't know. That's a really difficult one. I think that's going to be a fun thing to talk about with our guest when we talk about religious liberty. But yeah, I don't know. There's some really cool things we're going to get to talk about in a sec. But I think we did a pretty good job of covering over like most of the legal stuff. We didn't get into the latest, Cake Baker 2018 scandal or anything like that. But I mean, that's probably going to be a whole. I'm afraid to touch that with a 10-foot pole because people are gonna.
It's a little too topical for me. I don't do topical stuff, and
I'm gonna have my neighbors start my car for a couple weeks after if we do that.
I just don't do topical. Like if it happened in the past year, I'm probably not going to touch it. But yeah, again, I am going to touch it very briefly. Narrow ruling. Again, that's all they do is narrow rulings. We'll see if that ever changes in the near future, but I don't really have much hope that it is. I think they're going to.
Honestly, I don't think we're going to get something like the Warren or the Burger courts again, who set up a lot of these tests. I just don't see it because I don't think, because of the way the courts have become so politicized, I don't see them taking bold and revolutionary actions, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but it just feels unlikely. I think the courts are, for all the good that I think that Rehnquist and Roberts have done, I think they've also been a little too timid.
Yeah, to an extent, they might have been. But I think in the future, I'd really like to talk about some of the more foundational aspects of the law, as in I'm not the best legal person, as you guys have clearly observed. I think we need if we get guests on, talk a little bit more about some of the moral foundations of government, because that is a very important, because that's kind of how you operate. Governments are really based on what is right and what is wrong, and flow from there. And that's kind of very interesting to talk about.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty excited about it myself. But yeah, well, I think that's everything we wanted to cover today, guys. Appreciate everyone tuning in. What next episode is going to be freedom of the press? Yeah, we're talking about the Fourth Estate.
Yep, the Fourth Estate.
That's going to be fun. I love that. It's an exciting thing. But yeah, I really appreciate everyone tuning in today. It's you guys really don't understand how nice it is to see that we doubled our listener base from mother and now my mother. So God, it's just warming the heart. But as always, if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, hit us up and send us a note, tweet at us, make a YouTube video, tag us, whatever. I don't care. I'd love to just hear from you. And follow us on Twitter and on Facebook and YouTube. What's the right place for them to follow you at on Twitter there, Gracchus?
At Gracchus Minor. GRACCHUS Minor. If you can't spell minor, well, sorry.
Yeah, I would say it's probably not the Chilean minor.
Yeah.
Myself, follow me at Marcus Cicero 63 at Marcus Cicero 63. I also repost our stuff on my own blog, marcus-cicero.com. I promise I have blog posts to put up there. I'm kind of lazy. But yeah, we've got stuff. We're going there. Follow us on Twitter. Check out our YouTube stuff. We repost stuff all the time. And yeah, we'd love to hear from anyone who has any questions, comments, or concerns. We're really excited to finish up. We were probably going to do Freedom of Assembly, just kind of tie it in at the end on Freedom of the Press, because it's it's pretty. I feel like we did a pretty good job covering freedom of speech, and that's kind of freedom of assembly is pretty much tied in there. But we might do just a tiny bit about freedom of assembly, and then we're going to start our interview series on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of the press. I think we got some really cool people. We'll start making announcements with our next podcast. But yeah, we're gonna have some great people we're gonna talk to, and then we'll go from there on what our next topic is. But thanks again, guys, for listening. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing from you guys.
Yeah, thank you.